Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into a book today that really messes with how we think about reality, and it's called The Corruption of Reality: A Unified Theory of Religion, Hypnosis, and Psychopathology by John F. Schumaker.
Oh, wow. When I first saw that title, I was hooked right away. Religion, hypnosis, psychopathology, like what's the connection? And Schumacher's answer is so interesting. He says all these different things actually come from like the brain's ability to change how we see what's real.
It's like our brains have this hidden power to warp reality. And he says that's a part of religion, hypnosis, and even mental health. Where does he even start with all that?
Well, he starts by breaking down reality itself.
Yeah.
Just the idea of reality into three types. First, you've got primary reality, and that's just the world as it is, like without any human interpretation. Like imagine how a dog sees the world, just pure instinct, senses reacting.
So no deep thoughts about the universe, just pure senses. Got it. But then we humans come along and things get a little more complicated, right?
Exactly. So then Schumacher brings in personal reality, which is the reality we each build in our minds based on our own experiences, our beliefs, our biases. Like think about political debates. Two people can look at the same data but have totally opposite conclusions because their personal realities are shaping how they see it.
So it's like we each have our own colored glasses that change how we see the world. And sometimes those glasses make us see very different pictures.
Exactly. And then building on that, you've got cultural reality, and that's like the reality a whole society builds together. Our shared beliefs, norms, values, and Schumacher says religion is a big example of this.
So it's like how society agrees on one version of reality, like a shared story we tell ourselves about the world. And religion really shapes that story.
That's a great way to put it. It's like cultural reality adds another layer on top of the actual world.
Yeah.
And religion often gives us like a set of rules for how to see things.
Makes you wonder how much of what we think is real is actually just our own interpretation.
That's a big question. And to understand how these different realities can be so different, we need to talk about dissociation.
Dissociation. Now, a lot of people think that's a really extreme thing, right? Like multiple personalities. But Schumacher's saying it's way more common than that.
Right. She says it's a normal human thing we all do. It's the brain's ability to put information in separate boxes and create different streams of consciousness.
So it's not just zoning out on a long drive.
Exactly. It's like your mind making different channels, each with its own focus. It's how you can drive home without thinking while also replaying a conversation in your head. Or how someone with a phobia might avoid certain places. Their mind is basically building a safer reality by ignoring the threat.
So dissociation isn't some weird thing. It's actually a tool our minds use all the time. That's a pretty big idea.
It is. And here's where it gets really interesting because Schumacher says this ability to dissociate helps.
How does dissociation connect to those things?
Well, he says dissociation is a big part of how our minds become more open to suggestion, whether it's from a hypnotist or in a religious setting.
So when we dissociate, our brains are kind of ready to accept new ideas, even if they challenge our normal way of thinking.
Exactly. It's like dissociation creates a space in our minds where we're more receptive to outside influences, whether it's a hypnotist or a religious leader.
So are we talking about mind control? Are these people using dissociation to manipulate people?
Not necessarily. It's more complicated than that.
Right.
Though some people definitely do that, Schumacher says that a lot of religious practices and rituals might be doing this without even meaning to.
I'm starting to see how it all connects. Let's talk more about that. How does he connect dissociation to religion and music? What are some examples?
He talks about chanting and rhythmic music in religious ceremonies, like Gregorian chants, Sufi chanting, even drumming in some traditions. These kinds of music, with all the repetition, can create a feeling of trance.
It's funny you say that. I have felt that I'm being transported or lost in the music at some services, but I never really connected it to dissociation.
It's something we experience without realizing it, and it's not just music. Religious symbols and stories also play a role. These symbols, with all their deep meaning, can also trigger dissociation and shift how we see things.
So when someone sees a crucifix or a Star of David or a sacred text, it can make them see the world differently.
Exactly. And this is where Schumacher really makes us think about our own experiences. Have you ever felt really awestruck or you're transcending during a religious service? A feeling of being connected to something bigger than yourself?
I think most people who have had a strong spiritual experience would say yes.
Schumacher might say those feelings are at least partly because of the brain going into a dissociative state, which allows us to become aware of things in a different way.
It really makes you think. So we've got religion and music maybe linked to dissociation. But Schumacher doesn't stop there, right? He also connects it to mental health.
Right. He says that a lot of mental health conditions like phobias, eating disorders, and even psychosis involve seeing reality in a distorted way. And this is often helped along by dissociation.
Okay, so now it's not just about zoning out, it's about how our minds might use dissociation to deal with difficult or even traumatic experiences.
Yeah. And in these cases, dissociation might not be a good thing. It can be a way of escaping from difficult emotions and situations, even if it means like twisting reality in harmful ways.
That makes sense. But how does that actually work? Can you give us an example of how dissociation might happen with a specific mental health issue?
Sure. Think of someone with a really bad phobia of spiders. They might avoid going outside, they might check everywhere for spiders, and they might feel huge anxiety just thinking about a spider. Their fear might seem crazy to others, but for them it's real and it's controlling their life.
Okay, so their mind is totally focused on this fear of spiders. But how does that connect to dissociation?
Their mind might be blocking out or downplaying anything that goes against their phobia, which makes their distorted reality even stronger. For example, they might totally ignore the fact that most spiders are harmless or that it's really unlikely they'll get bitten.
So it's like their mind is saying, spiders are super dangerous, let's just avoid them and pretend they're not a threat.
Exactly. And while this might help them feel better for a little bit, it can really cause problems in the long run. It can trap them in a cycle of fear and avoidance.
This is all so fascinating, but we've only just scratched the surface of Schumacher's work.
I know, right? We've covered these three types of reality, how dissociation can shape our experiences, and the connections between religion, hypnosis, and even psychopathology. All of this comes back to the brain's ability to change what we see as real.
It's a lot to think about, but there's still more to explore. In part two, we'll go even deeper into Schumacher's ideas, which are really interesting and sometimes controversial.
We'll look at how he sees religion as a kind of socially acceptable hypnosis, and we'll unpack his claims about the link between mental health and distorting reality.
It's going to get even more mind-bending.
So welcome back. You know, one of the things that really gets you thinking in Schumacher's book is how he looks at the connection between religion and dissociation.
Yeah, in part one, we talked about how he sees religion as like a powerful example of cultural reality, that shared way of seeing the world that a whole society creates. But then he goes further and says that religion actually uses some of the same methods as hypnosis to shape our beliefs.
Exactly. He argues that a lot of religious practices and rituals, and they may not even be doing this on purpose, but they tap into these dissociative states. And that makes people more open to certain ideas and beliefs.
So it's not like religions are like intentionally trying to hypnotize people. It's more like their methods and rituals just kind of accidentally trigger these altered states of awareness.
That's a great way to think about it. And he gives some specific examples, like using repetitive chanting and rhythmic music in religious services. Like think about Gregorian chants in Catholicism, Sufi chanting in Islam, even gospel music in some Christian churches. These types of music, with all that repetition and that hypnotic quality, can make you feel like you're in a trance.
It was like the music helps to quiet your conscious mind, and that makes it easier to just get swept up in the experience, almost like you're entering a different state of consciousness.
That's a really interesting observation. And it's not just about music. Schumacher also talks about how powerful religious symbols and stories can be. These symbols, which often have such deep meaning and emotional weight, can also act as triggers for dissociation.
So imagine someone seeing a crucifix, or a Star of David, or a sacred text. Those images and words can bring up a whole flood of associations and emotions. And that could lead to a change in how they see things.
Exactly. Schumacher really wants us to look back at our own religious or spiritual experiences and think about the role that dissociation and suggestion might have played. Have you ever felt a sense of awe or transcendence during a religious service? You know, that feeling of connection to something much greater than yourself.
Oh, absolutely. Those moments can be so powerful and moving.
Well, Schumacher might say that those feelings are, at least in part, a result of your brain shifting into a dissociative state. And that allows a different kind of awareness to come to the surface.
Wow, this is really giving me a whole new perspective on my own spiritual experiences. But let's switch gears for a bit and talk about how Schumacher links dissociation to psychopathology. It seems like a pretty big leap.
It might seem that way at first, but Schumacher lays out a pretty convincing argument. He points out that a lot of psychological disorders like phobias, eating disorders, and even some types of psychosis involve seeing reality in a distorted way.
So instead of seeing religion as like a socially acceptable form of dissociation, like we were just talking about, he's saying that in these cases, the individual's mind is using dissociation to deal with psychological distress.
That's right. He argues that these disorders often represent attempts to create a version of reality that's easier to handle or less threatening, even if that created reality seems totally illogical or crazy to people around them.
Can you give us an example of how this might actually happen in real life with a specific disorder?
Sure. Let's take someone with a really severe social anxiety disorder. They might completely avoid social gatherings, constantly worry about what other people think of them, and have a really hard time speaking up even in casual settings. Their fear might seem way overblown to others, but for them it's a very real and painful experience.
So in this case, their mind is trying to protect them from what they see as the threat of social judgment, even if that threat is blown way out of proportion. But how does dissociation fit into all of this?
Their mind might be using dissociation to distance them from those situations that trigger their anxiety. They might avoid eye contact, withdraw from conversations, or even mentally check out during social interactions. It's a way to minimize their discomfort.
So they're basically creating a kind of mental buffer zone between themselves and the social situation, even if it means disconnecting from the people around them.
Exactly. And while this might give them some temporary relief from their anxiety, it can also prevent them from forming meaningful connections with people and experiencing the good things about social interaction.
It's starting to feel like dissociation can be a bit of a double-edged sword. It can be helpful in some situations, but in others, it can actually become an obstacle to fully experiencing life.
That's a really sharp observation. And that duality is really at the core of what Schumacher is trying to point out. Dissociation is a complex process with both positive and negative sides.
Okay, so we've got religion, music, and mental health all potentially linked to dissociation. But doesn't Schumacher also talk about how music itself can influence how we perceive reality?
He does. Remember how we were talking about music in religious ceremonies? Well, Schumacher takes that idea a step further and says that music, especially repetitive or rhythmic music, can have a powerful effect on our consciousness, even when it's not part of a religious context.
So, like, listening to my favorite playlist could be messing with my reality without me even knowing it. What's the science behind that?
Think about how certain types of music can really transport you. You lose yourself in the rhythm, it's almost like entering a trance. Schumacher argues that this feeling of being completely immersed in the music is actually a form of dissociation. It's like the music creates its own separate reality that we can escape into.
That's a pretty wild thought. I'm definitely going to be paying more attention to how music affects me from now on.
It's definitely something to think about.
Yeah.
Just consider how music is used in advertising, in movies, even in political campaigns. It can stir up strong emotions, influence our moods, and even shape our opinions. Schumacher's work suggests that some of this influence might come from music's ability to tap into those dissociative states.
So it's like music can sneak past our conscious filters and directly affect our subconscious mind.
That's one way to put it. And it's not always a bad thing. Music can be incredibly therapeutic and healing. But it's important to be aware of how much power it has to shape our perceptions and influence our actions.
This is all pretty mind-blowing stuff. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the 3 types of reality to how dissociation works, the influence of religion and culture, the connection to mental health, and even the power of music. It's amazing how Schumacher ties it all together.
It really is. And he doesn't shy away from the big philosophical questions either. One of the most thought-provoking parts of his work is how he challenges our basic understanding of what reality is.
Right. If our brains are so good at distorting reality, how can we be sure of anything? Does objective reality even exist?
Those are the big questions. And Schumacher doesn't give us any easy answers. But he does encourage us to think critically about our own perceptions and to recognize that what we see as real might not actually match up with primary reality, that raw, unfiltered world we talked about earlier.
It's like he's saying we need to be aware of the filters we're using, the stories we're telling ourselves, and the ways in which our brains are constantly shaping our experience of the world around us.
Exactly. And that awareness is the first step towards becoming more conscious architects of our own reality.
I love that idea. Instead of just passively accepting whatever reality our brains present to us, we can actually choose what kind of realities we want to live in, at least to some degree. But how do we even start doing that?
Well, that's a question we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at the practical implications of Schumacher's work. Like, how can we become more aware of our own biases, challenge our own assumptions, and ultimately develop a more mindful relationship with reality?
Welcome back to our deep dive into the corruption of reality. It's been really interesting exploring John F. Schumacher's ideas about how our brains are always like shaping and distorting how we see the world.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. We've seen how this, corruption can show up in so many ways, from religious rituals to how we cope with mental health issues to even the power of music.
And it's made me wonder if we can ever really trust what we think is real. Like, is everything just something our minds made up?
That's a really big question, and Schumacher doesn't say he has all the answers, but he does give us an interesting way to think about how to handle this whole idea of reality.
Okay, I'm listening. What's the secret to not getting lost in our own minds?
Well, one of the big things Schumacher says is that we need to realize that how we see things is subjective. He reminds us that what we see as real is always filtered through our own experiences, beliefs, and biases.
It's like we're all walking around with these special glasses that change how we see the world. And sometimes those glasses can make us see very different things, even when we're looking at the same thing.
Exactly. And being aware of those glasses, understanding how they change our perceptions, that's the first step. It's like taking off the glasses and really looking at them, figuring out how they're changing the image.
So it's about realizing that our view of reality is always just a part of the whole picture, and it's influenced by our own unique perspective.
That's kind of a humbling thought.
It is. And Schumacher says that being humble like this is actually a good thing. It makes us open to the idea that other people's perceptions, even if they seem weird or don't make sense to us, might be just as real and important as our own.
It's like that saying, walk a mile in someone else's shoes, but in this case, it's more like look through someone else's glasses.
I like that. And it's so important because it helps us understand each other better. It helps us bridge the gap between different realities and find common ground even when we see things differently.
So we need to acknowledge that our own perceptions aren't the only ones that matter and be open to other people's realities. But how do we actually do that? How do we become more conscious about shaping our own experiences? Well, Schumacher says that critical thinking is really important. We need to always question what we assume, look for different perspectives, and be willing to challenge our own beliefs, even the ones that are really important to us.
So it's not about just blindly accepting whatever our brains tell us is real, but about actively thinking about information and coming to our own conclusions.
Exactly. And this takes work. We have to step outside of our comfort zones, be open to new ideas, and be willing to change our minds when we see evidence that contradicts what we believe.
It's about having that curiosity, that willingness to learn and grow, even if it means questioning things we've always believed.
Right. And this is something we can work on our whole lives. There's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, and more about our own reality to understand.
Schumacher's work is really a call to action, isn't it? It's not just about understanding these ideas in our heads, but about using them in our lives, being more mindful and intentional about how we create our own realities.
Absolutely. And while it might sound hard at first, it's also really empowering. Imagine having more control over how you react to challenges, how you connect with other people, and how you experience the world around you.
That's a really cool idea. Instead of just accepting whatever reality our brains give us, we can actually take part in shaping our own experiences.
Exactly. And this doesn't mean we can just wish away our problems or create a perfect life with no problems. But it does mean we have more control than we think when it comes to choosing how we deal with those challenges and how we make sense of things that happen in our lives.
So it's about recognizing that our minds have the power to shape our experiences, but also realizing that there are limits. We can't control everything, but we can control how we react, how we interpret things, and how we choose to move forward.
Well said. It's a delicate balance, and Schumacher gives us a guide to navigate that balance with more awareness, intention, and even a little bit of playfulness.
That's a good point. It doesn't have to be all serious and heavy. Realizing that reality is corrupted can actually be freeing. It can open us up to new possibilities, new ways of thinking, and a deeper appreciation for just how complex being human really is.
I totally agree. It's about embracing the mystery, the uncertainty, and even the absurdity of it all.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what final thought would you leave our listeners with?
I think Schumacher's work ultimately asks us to be more curious about our own minds, more compassionate towards others, and more open to all the different possibilities of what reality could be.
That's a great way to put it. It's been an amazing journey exploring the corruption of reality with all its mind-bending ideas and thought-provoking questions. We hope this deep dive has made you curious, challenged some of your assumptions, and maybe even inspired you to become more conscious about how you create your own reality.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep corrupting your reality in the best ways possible.